predictable heel turn on RFK Jr. Once upon a time, it seemed that Sean Hannity was excited about no presidential candidate more than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In June, the Fox News host marveled that Kennedy was surging in the Democratic primary, potentially meaning that President Biden's bid for renomination was in jeopardy. Kennedy wasn't surging in the polls, at least not among Democrats, but Hannity seemed perfectly happy to try to will such a surge into existence. In late July, he turned over a full hour of his program to Kennedy, the sort of campaign contribution that he normally reserved for Republican candidates, as he did so often before last year's midterm elections. Kennedy was running against a Democrat, and that was good enough for Hannity. So he welcomed Kennedy to a town hall in front of a live audience, though the only one asking questions was Sean Hannity. Those questions were no less pointed than the ones 2022 Republican candidates faced. Kennedy's challenge to Biden was framed in near-heroic terms, positioning the conspiracy theory enthusiast as the sole person brave enough to challenge the Democratic establishment. Many of his fellow Democrats and others in the media mob, make no mistake, they are right now furious with RFK Jr., Hannity said as he was introducing his guest. They seem to loathe his stance on medical freedom and privacy, a sanitization of Kennedy's anti-vaccine stance. They are angry he does not toe the party line on the war in Ukraine and former President Donald Trump. They can't seem to stand that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a free thinker with classic liberal principles. And today, well, today's Democratic Party is about compliance. It's about going along. It's about groupthink. So Hannity was happy to provide a soapbox. About 2.2 million people tuned into Hannity's program that night, about in line with Hannity's regular weeknight audience. They heard Hannity tee up a number of issues on which he could express agreement, from economic insecurity to the effort to sideline hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19. Hannity made clear his welcoming intent at the outset. "We definitely don't agree on everything," he said, "but that's not my role here tonight. We're not going to shut down Robert F. Kennedy Jr." He noted that some people wanted to deplatform Kennedy because he regularly spreads misinformation about vaccine safety, though Hannity didn't mention that. "I actually believe in freedom and freedom of speech and the freedom of the American people to hear things that they may disagree with and ascertain and determine for themselves whether they agree or don't agree," Hannity solemnly stated. Then Kennedy announced that he would run not as a Democrat against Biden but as an independent, against both Biden and whoever wins the Republican nomination for president. That almost certainly means running against Hannity's friend Donald Trump. It also may mean pulling more support from Trump than from Biden, which is very much not what Hannity or other Republicans would like to see. So, when Kennedy again joined Hannity on Tuesday night, he earned a much briefer and colder reception. "Everybody is now trying to analyze, whether there's a three-way race with you, Donald Trump and Joe Biden," Hannity said as he began his interview. "Who would you more likely draw from? So I hope you don't mind, but I did a little research on you. You're pretty liberal," he continued. "You've called for curbing logging, oil drilling, fracking. You wanted to eliminate it and call it a victory for democracy. You want to curb U.S. fossil fuel extraction, keep it in the ground. You once tweeted you want a ban on fossil fuel extraction, a ban on fracking. You called the NRA once a terror group. You supported over the years Democrats, Al Gore, John Kerry, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. You praised Bernie Sanders multiple times. You support affirmative action. So why is this party of yours, why didn't they even allow you to compete? Because that's as pretty liberal of a record as anybody I know." Kennedy responded to this unsubtle line of questioning with a chuckle, noting that Hannity didn't really ask any question. "Do you want to talk about my positions, Sean?" he asked, "or do you want to read talking points from the Trump campaign?" "Excuse me," Hannity replied. "These are called Hannity points. I do my own research. This is certainly possible in theory. But it is true that, on Tuesday, the Republican National Committee published a list of Kennedy's positions intended to frame him as unacceptably liberal. The list included most of the assertions Hannity presented in introducing his guest. It's also the case that Kennedy's announcement had already triggered Republican condemnation. Last week, Semaphore reported on the Trump campaign's preparations to undercut the independent. Kennedy can be forgiven for drawing that line. At times, Hannity's prosecution of Kennedy on Tuesday was almost revelatory, a glimpse of what might be possible in a world where Hannity didn't dedicate his show night after night to aiding Trump or Trump's party. Do you still believe the NRA is a terror group? Hannity asked, for example. I support the Second Amendment, Kennedy replied, like I do all the amendments in the Constitution. I didn't ask you if you support the Second Amendment, Hannity firmly interjected. In 2018, you said Parkland students are right, the NRA's a terror group. Do you believe that? I don't consider the NRA a terror group, Kennedy replied, seemingly chastened. The segment ended with Hannity and Kennedy sparring over the feasibility of replacing fossil fuels, with Hannity insisting that Kennedy's claims weren't true, something that it's hard to imagine him saying during a Trump interview. But, then, Hannity's interviews are focused on helping Trump, not hurting him. It's understandable that Kennedy would want to do Hannity's show, given the uphill task he faces in winning the presidency. But it's surprising that he wouldn't have been prepared for a very different reception from Hannity now that he'll probably be running against Hannity's friend. How Republicans lauded RFK Jr. before he was a threat. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced Monday that he would end his primary challenge to President Biden and instead run for the White House as an independent. And with the announcement, not only did a long-running GOP effort to elevate him in the service of embarrassing Biden go up in smoke, but Kennedy now appears to pose a potential spoiler threat by taking more votes from former President Donald Trump than Biden. What has resulted is a remarkable turnabout in how Republicans and the right talk about Kennedy. In recent days, the Republican National Committee has called Kennedy just another radical, far-left Democrat while detailing 23 reasons Republicans should oppose him. RNC Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel said Kennedy is a typical elitist liberal, and voters won't be fooled. And Trump's campaign made it even clearer that it fears a potential spoiler candidacy from Kennedy, who is much more popular with Republicans than Democrats. Voters should not be deceived by anyone who pretends to have conservative values, Trump spokesman Stephen Chung said in a statement. He added that an RFK candidacy is nothing more than a vanity project for a liberal Kennedy to cash in on his family's name. This is a far cry from how the right, and even Trump himself, once talked about Kennedy. And to the extent MAGA voters are fooled into thinking he's one of them, Republicans will have themselves to blame. While Republicans are now pitching Kennedy as an opportunist and a radical, Trump in late June vouched for Kennedy's character and common sense. He's a very smart guy, and a good guy, Trump said, adding, he's a very good man, and his heart is in the right place. He's a common sense guy, and so am I, Trump said. So, whether you're conservative or liberal, common sense is common sense. While they now suggest Kennedy should be persona non grata for conservative voters, key Trump-aligned strategists, including Stephen K. Bannon and Roger Stone, have pushed Kennedy as a possible running mate for Trump. Stone in April called a Trump-Kennedy ticket a dream ticket, while Bannon said 2 months ago that it would lead to a massive landslide in Trump's favor. Bannon even called Kennedy's more liberal views irrelevant in the broader context. I understand that he doesn't have policies on life and guns that are absolutely perfect and aligned with MAGA, there's no doubt about that, but he's talking about the central issues facing the country, as Donald Trump is, and that's why the other stuff is irrelevant, Bannon said in June, referring to Trump's Make America Great Again motto. This is how Republicans often talked about Kennedy, acknowledging the ways in which he is out of step with the GOP but playing down the significance of that. The other leading contender for the Republican presidential nomination, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, acknowledged those political differences in late July. But he also said he might appoint Kennedy to a key position at the Food and Drug Administration or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Another candidate who has made inroads with MAGA Republicans, Vivek Ramaswamy, has also floated Kennedy as his possible running mate. And Bannon and Stone have hardly been the only conservative media influencers to sing Kennedy's praises. When Kennedy launched his campaign in April, then Fox News host Tucker Carlson also vouched for Kennedy's character and alignment with the MAGA movement on the most important issues. Bobby Kennedy himself is not extreme. He is deeply insightful, and above all he is honest, Carlson said, adding, we're not Democrats, but Bobby Kennedy is one of the most remarkable people we have ever met, and we are honored to have him on our show. While the Trump campaign now calls Kennedy's campaign a vanity project, Carlson assured of Kennedy, he's not running to get rich. He's trying to make things better. House Republicans also invited Kennedy to testify in July, an extraordinary invitation for a current presidential candidate, and promoted him as a serious combatant in the battle against censorship. It's why Mr. Kennedy is running for president, to help us expose and stop what's going on, said Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, now a top GOP candidate to become House Speaker. Representative Chip Roy, Republican, Texas, added while introducing Kennedy, "It is for this that Mr. Kennedy finds himself receiving the scorn of both the political left and right, because if one dares challenge the orthodoxy of the powers that be, then one is their enemy." It was around that time that the right's sudden interest in Kennedy did prove too much for at least one Republican congresswoman. Shortly before the hearing, none other than Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, GA, stepped forward to urge her party to slow its roll in embracing him. "So I agree with Bobby Kennedy on a lot of things," she said, citing his position on vaccines and the CIA, "but I tell you what, I think there's a lot of Republicans that have been fooled by him. He's not a Republican, everyone. He's very much a Democrat. Now he's an independent. And a lot of Republicans are probably wishing they had heeded Greene's advice earlier." Ron DeSantis is still running for president. There are 3 situations in which a poker player might go all in. One is that she has such a good hand that she's confident no one else can take the pot. A second is when the player wants the others at the table to think she has that good a hand, so she bluffs. And then there's the third, when she runs out of chips to play. Maybe Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's big push for the Iowa caucuses, reported on Wednesday, is a bluff. Maybe it's an effort to suggest more strength than is apparent externally. It pretty clearly isn't because DeSantis has a particularly good hand there, or anywhere else, really. Polling in the state consistently shows him down at least 20 points and not gaining ground. Or maybe it's just the only chips he has left. There have been recent opportunities for DeSantis to reshape the GOP nominating contest. Over the course of the past 6 weeks, the Republican Party has hosted 2 primetime debates, with millions of people tuning in. The day before the first debate, DeSantis had the support of about 15% of the likely primary voter pool in 538's average of polls. A week after the debate, he sat at 15%. But then came the second debate, about a month after the first one. On the day of the debate, DeSantis was at 14%. A week later, he is still at 14%. If math isn't your thing, allow me to crunch the numbers. DeSantis has lost 1 percentage point since the day before the first debate. That didn't blunt the enthusiasm his team offered for Wednesday's news. The campaign announced that it had raised $15 million in the third quarter, a significant fundraising haul that shuts down the doubters who counted out Ron DeSantis for far too long, campaign manager James Uthmere said in a statement. But only $5 million of that can be used for the primary, which is a significant limitation. Perhaps the doubters still have some cause to raise doubts? The outside PAC that's aiding DeSantis, more than such PACs normally do, in fact, collected as much as $20 million in additional fundraising, according to reporting from the Dispatch. Maybe it's lowballing those estimates to overperform once the numbers are reported publicly, but the Dispatch also had DeSantis's team coming in right at $15 million. Perhaps you remember, though, that PAC's exhortations right before the first debate. It needed $50 million before the end of September, potential donors were told, according to the New York Times, with DeSantis needing to beat Trump in the next 60 days while distancing himself from rivals immediately. If I might again serve as your personal calculator, $20 million is substantially less than $50 million. I will also note that DeSantis has not obviously beaten Trump, though it's not really clear what that meant. This hasn't stopped the Trump campaign from giddily emailing reporters with its kiss of death countdown, running out the clock until 60 days pass. It is clear, though, that DeSantis has very much not separated from the rest of the field. In mid-August, he was leading business executive Vivek Ramaswamy by 7 points. Now, he leads former ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley by 6 points. Haley was the only candidate to gain much ground after the first debate, though not enough to move into second place. She has ticked up more since the second one, too. A poll conducted by Suffolk University for the Boston Globe and USA Today put her in second place in New Hampshire for the first time, usurping the position held in most polls by a certain Florida governor. She's not threatening Trump to any significant degree, but she's also not getting kiss of death countdowns. Trump, meanwhile, is calling for his party to just skip the debates and admit he's going to be the nominee. So DeSantis is pushing his chips to Iowa. Several of his staffers in Tallahassee will be relocated to the state as the governor aims for an early upset that, maybe, finally, could shake up the race. Maybe, DeSantis hopes, he can repeat the successes notched by past Iowa caucus winners, including Ted Cruz in 2016, Rick Santorum in 2012 and Mike Huckabee in 2008. At the very least, the Times wrote, he hopes to perhaps show that Trump is beatable, useful given that DeSantis's long-standing Trump is an electoral loser pitch has been hard to defend when the former president is up by 30 points in the polls. There is, of course, another thing that losing poker players can do, rather than go all in. They can fold and cash out what they have left. Arizona recount law could delay certifying 2024 election, officials say. Phoenix, if the 2024 presidential election is close in Arizona, a newly enacted state law will mandate a ballot recount that will probably cause the state to miss crucial deadlines for certifying the vote, according to documents obtained by the Washington Post and interviews with elections officials. Arizona was central to attempts by President Donald Trump and his allies to change the outcome of the 2020 election, and many Republican primary voters in the state continue to be fixated on election denialism, a movement stoked by Trump and others who refuse to accept the results. The battleground state is expected to play a pivotal role in the next presidential election, and any holdup in counting votes there could cause chaos. In a September 11 letter to the County Supervisors Association of Arizona and the Arizona Association of Counties, an organization representing election officials from all of the state's 15 counties wrote that the new law, passed after President Biden's narrow win in Arizona in 2020, will put in jeopardy immovable deadlines on the election calendar, including those that are part of the Electoral College process and those that confirm the winners of August primaries so that general election ballots can be mailed to military and overseas voters. Worst-case scenario, more than half a dozen election officials told the Post, Arizona could delay pivotal steps in the process for sitting a president. The prospect of triggering an electoral crisis has led voting administrators, their lawyers, and organizations that represent them to demand immediate solutions from Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs, Democrat, and leaders in the GOP-controlled legislature. One major proposal would move Arizona's primary election earlier in the summer. Other ideas to buy more time during the general election include speeding up the proofreading of ballots and allowing local officials to more quickly transmit results to the state. The entire United States would have to be waiting on us, said Kent Volkmer, the attorney representing Pinal County, which is southeast of Phoenix and is among the state's most conservative areas. The entirety of the American people will be waiting on the state of Arizona. Sam Alters, the county manager of Mojave County, a conservative area in northern Arizona, said in an interview that the concerns are real and impactful to every county. Not meeting the timelines could have very consequential implications on the state's ability to certify the election results nationally and locally, Alters said. A confluence of factors has set off alarm among elections officials. After Trump's razor-thin loss in 2020 that ushered in attacks on the once obscure management of elections, Republican and Democratic lawmakers proposed a measure intended to strengthen confidence in electoral outcomes. The measure lowered the threshold that triggers automatic recounts in certain races, including statewide and legislative ones. At the time, county officials warned that the proposal would increase the number of contests needing time-intensive recounts. They also said the measure could complicate their abilities to hit mandatory deadlines between primary and general elections. The implications of the bipartisan law have not been tested during a full election cycle because the law did not take effect until the 2022 midterm general election. Previously, recounts in Arizona were infrequent. But the competitive nature of the state, combined with the new law, resulted in at least 3 recounts last November, 1 for a legislative seat in a swing district and 2 for statewide offices, including the contest for Attorney General that was won by just 280 votes. Based on that experience, and projecting higher voter turnout during the presidential cycle, election officials estimate that it will take about 3 weeks to recount ballots during the August primary election. It could take even longer to recount votes after the 2024 general election, officials said, pushing up against the deadline for the issuance of certificates of ascertainment of presidential electors, as well as the meeting of electors to vote for president and vice president. "We're unfortunately moving into a perfect storm of timing," said Jennifer Marson, executive director of the Arizona Association of Counties, which lobbies for counties. She said it is unclear what would happen if the state misses 2 pivotal dates that are part of the presidential certification process, namely the December 17, 2024, vote of electors that helps determine an electoral college winner. "If we miss that deadline, we are in uncharted territory," Marson said. "To my knowledge, that deadline has never been missed by any state, ever. For a mandatory recount, election workers would have to wait for an order from a court and then retally millions of ballots through tabulation machines and audit samples of those ballots. After the primary, this would have to happen while simultaneously preparing to run the general election." Scott Jarrett, elections director in Maricopa, the state's largest county, and president of the Election Officials of Arizona, which represents election officials in all 15 counties, wrote in the letter to the 2 organizations that represent the state's counties that the situation would introduce opportunities for errors and inaccuracies. Election officials face strict and complex timelines set by federal and state laws that affect everything from ensuring the accuracy of candidate names, to printing ballots, to inserting ballots into envelopes, to mailing ballots to military and overseas voters 45 days before the election, or September 21, 2024, according to the letter. Color-coded calendars gaming out the scenario illustrate the problem, with anticipated primary election recount activities overlapping with deadlines ahead of, and well past, the general election. One version of the calendar estimates that counties would begin transmitting results to the Arizona Secretary of State on December 16, 2024, a day before electors are required to meet to cast votes for president and vice president, according to the National Archives' timeline of Electoral College events. That version pegs the results of the state's recounts to become available on December 28, 2024. To prepare for anticipated recounts, officials are looking for ways to build in extra time to conduct the anticipated retallies. They are considering options that would move up the dates of certain duties required under state law and shorten the amount of time to perform them. Options to buy time include moving the date of the August 6 primary election to earlier in the summer, reducing the number of days to proofread ballots, ensuring that courts can work during the weekends to order recounts, and allowing rural officials to transmit election results electronically rather than driving them to the Secretary of State's office in Phoenix. Members of the 2 associations that represent Arizona counties passed a resolution in September conveying an urgent need for state leaders to act, given the fast-approaching election calendar. The problem, the resolution said, is neither a financial nor personnel problem, but a problem of statutory timelines and deadlines. Election officials met this week with the governor's chief of staff, attorney, and top legislative aides, who created a task force that is also examining election laws and procedures. During the meeting, the aides expressed interest in resolving the issue but did not elaborate on how they would approach the problem, according to the 3 people familiar with the conversation who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss details about the private meeting. Hobbs's aides told the Post on Wednesday that the governor's team has begun talking to state lawmakers about the issue. Hobbs, who was Secretary of State during the 2020 election, said that she is aware of expected effects of the new recount law and is glad to partner with elections officials for a legislative fix. In 2024, all eyes will be on Arizona, Hobbs said in a statement. "We must ensure that Arizonans' votes are counted, including in the presidential election, and that the American people have full confidence in our election processes and our democracy." In recent weeks, Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes, Democrat, and his team have met with local election officials and their representatives to help game out options to fix the problem. Fontes has also been examining the implications of the new recount law and how proposed fixes could affect county operations. As chief elections officer for the state, the secretary's job is to ensure that the proposed solution works for all of Arizona's 15 counties, said Paul Smith Leonard, a spokesman for the Secretary of State. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays, Democrat, is aware of the issue and is meeting with county election officials this month to explore possible solutions, a spokesperson said. One elections director from a conservative, rural Arizona county, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly about the looming problem, expressed optimism that a solution would be found. "I'm very hopeful that working with our legislators will result in a solution that will allow Arizona election officials the days they need to statutorily conduct automatic recounts," the director said in a written statement. Illinois Democrats drew new maps. The changes pushed the GOP to the right. The state's congressional redistricting illustrates how gerrymandering hollows out the political center and strengthens the fringe, experts say. It also helps explain Kevin McCarthy's downfall. Taylorville, Illinois, on a warm Friday night in the St. Mary's Catholic Church parking lot, sweating men sipping cold beers dipped fish fillets into bubbling deep fryers as children played on the bouncy castle. This down-home fish fry used to be a regular stop for U.S. Representative Rodney Davis, a moderate Republican who grew up in this former coal town in central Illinois. But that was before new district lines drawn in 2021 pushed him into far more conservative terrain and into competition with a fellow GOP incumbent. To keep his job in Congress, Davis had to square off with Representative Mary E. Miller, a member of the right-wing Freedom Caucus who closely aligned herself with former President Donald Trump. In the primary campaign, she assailed Davis for his willingness to compromise with Democrats and to acknowledge Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election. Miller, the hardliner, won the 2022 race. Davis, the consensus seeker, was out. The bitter Republican feuding was not merely a symptom of the broader civil war in the National Party. Rather, it was prompted by the actions of Illinois Democrats, who used their supermajority in the legislature to redraw district lines in a way that would strengthen their already titanium-solid lock on power. The strategy worked, adding one Democratic seat to the Illinois delegation and trimming two Republican ones as GOP voters were packed into a smaller number of districts. The new map also accomplished what experts say gerrymandering does with ruthless efficiency, regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans are responsible, hollowing out the moderate political center and driving both parties further toward the ideological fringes. Gerrymandering undermines a key element of democracy, which is competition, said Harvard University government professor Stephen Levitsky. Politicians representing more evenly split districts fear general election competition and therefore tend to govern more moderately, Levitsky said. But those in lopsided districts worry more about primary challenges and become responsive to the extremes in their party. The consequences were on vivid display during the past couple of weeks in Congress as a small group of hard-right Republicans drove the government to the brink of a shutdown and then expelled Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, from the post of House Speaker, the first speaker in the nation's history to be ousted by members of his own party. The 8 GOP members who voted to reject him represent districts that are safely Republican, with little to fear in general election contests against Democrats. Miller was not among those 8 dissenters, but she was part of a larger group of hard-right Republicans that had earlier blocked McCarthy's spending plans, forcing him to work with Democrats to avert a government shutdown, a collaboration that helped to seal his fate. Levitsky, a co-author of the book Tyranny of the Minority, said the push to the extremes has been particularly evident in the Trump-led Republican Party and that gerrymandering is one cause among many. What's really new about our politics today is that the radical fringe on the right, who are pretty authoritarian and pretty nativist, are now exercising outsized power, Levitsky said. But for both parties, the primary election, dominated by the most ideologically committed voters, has become more important as districts with competitive general elections have dwindled. Over the past quarter-century, the number of House swing seats, as calculated by the Cook Political Report, has been cut in half, from 164 in 1999 to an estimated 82 in next year's election. Only 25 incumbents, 6% of the House's 435 seats, were defeated in 2022. 16 of them lost in primaries. Gerrymandering isn't the only factor driving that phenomenon. Geographic sorting, in which cities have become bluer and rural areas redder, has contributed mightily. Drawing lines to favor your own party also is not a new dynamic. But it has become more common and aggressive with the rise of supermajority state legislatures and a 2019 Supreme Court ruling that federal courts have no role in policing partisan efforts to rig district maps. In recent years, Republicans have used their dominance at the state level to create highly favorable maps in large states, such as Texas and Florida, as well as smaller ones, including Tennessee and Utah. But where Democratic legislators control the process, they've proved equally adept at creating maps advantageous to their party. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project, a nonpartisan group that studies the issue nationally, gave the Illinois map an F rating and classified none of the state's 17 congressional districts as competitive. Although Democratic voters unquestionably outnumber Republicans in the state, Biden defeated Trump by 17 points in Illinois in 2020. The effect is exaggerated by district lines that have helped to give Democrats a 14-3 advantage in the state's congressional delegation. In a comparison with a baseline map with no partisan advantage, Princeton researchers found that Illinois Democrats had given themselves 3 additional seats, a total matched only by Republicans in Texas. Illinois' new district lines for 2022 made the few GOP districts that remained even redder, which created a problem for 2 moderate Republicans. Representative Adam Kinzinger, an outspoken Trump critic who was certain to have drawn a strong primary challenge in 2022, opted to leave Congress. Davis fought to stay but found his moderate record used against him in his re-election bid against Miller. His willingness to reach across the aisle had made him a favored partner of Democrats and had helped him win general elections in his politically balanced district. But that instinct for compromise, he said in an interview, became a liability under the new Democratic drawn map. Davis said he was hammered in the primary 4 pictures with Biden. Pictures with Obama. Not Trumpy enough. Voted for common sense immigration reform, etc., etc., etc. Davis called the gerrymandering and Miller's attacks on him unsurprising. At the Taylorville fish fry, some of Davis's former constituents were more pointed. Rodney got screwed, said Bob Davis, 88, a retired school administrator having dinner with his family at a picnic table. I think it should be illegal. When you intentionally draw the lines for political reasons, I think that's wrong. The cost of bipartisanship. Manipulation of voting districts has been around since at least 18th century England. It became known as gerrymandering in 1812 when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry approved a district whose odd shape reminded people of a salamander. The new 13th district in Illinois more closely resembles a snake. It squiggles across 175 miles of lightly populated and Republican-leaning farmland and connects the more urban and Democratic-leaning areas of East St. Louis, Springfield, Decatur, Champaign and Urbana. It is a safely Democratic district, which was won in 2022 by first-time candidate Nikki Budzinski, a longtime labor union official who also served in the Biden administration. Taylorville had been part of the old 13th district, which was split fairly evenly between Republicans and Democrats, with just a 4-point GOP advantage, according to the Cook Political Report. Davis won the district first in 2012 and was re-elected 4 times, serving 10 years largely as a center-right moderate. Then, in the most recent redistricting, Taylorville was moved into a new 15th district, a largely rural and conservative bloc that almost completely surrounds the 13th and that had been made significantly more Republican by the shifting lines, giving it a 22-point GOP edge. As Davis fought to stay in Congress last year, he stressed his Republican bona fides. Campaign materials reminded primary voters that he had been proud to work with President Trump, and he sought the former president's endorsement. But his opponent, Miller, was quick to note that Davis had also voted to certify Biden's 2020 election victory, which she called tainted, and supported the creation of a congressional commission to investigate the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. In a matchup of Republican incumbents, it wasn't even close. After Trump came to the district to campaign for Miller, she cruised to a primary victory, 57% to 43%. In sharp contrast to Davis's approach, which he describes as principled compromise, Miller is rated by VoteView, a nonpartisan research group that tracks congressional voting and ideology, as more conservative than 98% of current House members. She has called for the impeachments of Biden and Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and a ban on further funding for Ukraine's defense against Russia's invasion. Miller did not vote to remove McCarthy when he was ousted from the job Tuesday, explaining in a statement that she wants her party to be focused on stopping the radical Democrats. But she has repeatedly sided with a small group of hard-right Republicans that frequently sparred with McCarthy and ultimately doomed his speakership. Miller, whose office did not respond to requests for an interview, voted against McCarthy's getting the job of Speaker in January. In June, she voted against suspending the debt ceiling. Then she voted against the bill that averted the government shutdown. Political scientists and analysts said that when state Democrats packed so many conservatives into a single district, they created the environment for Miller to win despite holding views that are out of step with most general election voters in Illinois and even with most GOP House members. Gerrymandering really disincentivizes reasonableness and bipartisanship, said Riley Berg, a senior advisor at Country First, a nonprofit organization founded by Kinzinger after the January 6 attack. We end up with choices in the general election that are not representative of the vast majority of the electorate. Davis said the impact of unchecked gerrymandering was simple and stark. The cost is Congress not working as our forefathers intended Congress to work. You have people in Congress, in both parties, who are rewarded for not working with the other side, he said. Gerrymandering was given a boost in 2019 by the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 that partisan redistricting is a political question that must be decided by legislators, not federal courts. The court upheld earlier precedents when it ruled this year that gerrymandering for racial reasons still violates the Voting Rights Act, even as Republican-dominated Southern legislatures, such as Alabama's, have resisted making maps that comply with the court's orders. In most states, the legislature is responsible for drawing district maps. In many of the growing number of states where one party holds a supermajority in the legislature, enough votes to override any veto by the governor, the process of drawing districts for federal and state offices has become increasingly partisan. At present, 19 Republican states and 9 Democratic states have supermajorities. That includes Illinois, where the governor, both U.S. senators and 2/3 of the state legislature are Democrats. Democrats in the state deny that the lines drawn in 2021 amount to gerrymandering. I would say it was a fair and equitable process, said State Senator Robert Peters, Democrat. We took feedback from stakeholders in the community throughout the entire state. And we held hearings all over the state and followed the guidelines to create the map. Republicans dismiss such defenses, saying that Democrats used their political supermajority to muscle through a blatant gerrymander. Illinois Democrats will tell you they believe in gerrymandering reform, then laugh all the way to drawing districts that eviscerate Republicans, Davis said. The parties have different stances on how to address gerrymandering. Democrats have pushed for federal legislation that would require that maps be drawn by independent commissions. Republicans have largely resisted those calls. For the redistricting process that followed the 2020 census, 10 states had independent or bipartisan commissions to draw legislative districts, according to the Cook Political Report. They included Democratic-dominated California and Colorado and the key swing states of Arizona and Michigan. Other states had commissions that answered to a partisan legislature. In states that did not have commissions, Republicans controlled redistricting in 17 and Democrats in 7. As both parties focus on shoring up their bases, fewer Americans are identifying with either. According to Gallup, close to 50% of Americans now consider themselves political independents, while only about a quarter identify as Republicans or Democrats. 2 decades ago, independents, Republicans, and Democrats each had about a 1/3 share of voters. The middle in America wants its voice and choice back, said Kent Thiry, a former executive in the healthcare industry who runs a group called Unite America that is fighting to reform gerrymandering and the primary voting system. Change is needed, he said, in a political system where if you cross the aisle, you are not re-elected. Bring dollars back. Davis, 53, was born and raised in Taylorville, a town of 11,000 people about 25 miles southeast of Springfield, the Illinois capital. Many storefronts along the central square are empty, but a few restaurants and shops are busy. One building still lists the office of Congressman Rodney Davis as a second-floor tenant. When coal was king, the town was pro-union and a Democratic stronghold. But in recent decades, Taylorville has shifted further toward the Republican Party. Mayor Bruce Berry said the town's strong history with both parties made it fertile ground for a centrist Republican such as Davis. Miller's hardline views, by contrast, don't really represent Taylorville, said Berry, whose position is nonpartisan but who considers himself a centrist Democrat in a moderate Republican town. We're strong Republicans down here, but I don't think we're out their way right, he said. We look more for common-sense decisions. Berry said the town is feeling the sting of Davis's absence as an advocate for its interests in Washington. Davis, a longtime congressional staffer before he ran for office, was instrumental in getting a $650,000 federal grant for a new industrial park on the edge of town, as well as $2.5 million to resurface West Main Street, a key local thoroughfare, Berry said. These are projects that we depend on. We don't have the tax base that others do, Berry explained. He expressed frustration that Miller has not applied for funding for local projects in her district. The House Freedom Caucus, of which Miller is a member, wants a ban on such earmarks, often called pork barrel projects. The caucus believes that government spending is out of control and that earmarks represent a lack of fiscal responsibility in Washington, according to its public statements. Earmarks facilitate federal overreach by spending taxpayer dollars on personal pet projects of lawmakers and lobbyists. Earmarks also extend Congress's power of spending beyond items genuinely connected to the nation's welfare, according to the caucus's rules. Seth McMillan, a Taylorville native and a former chairman of the Christian County Republican Central Committee, said Davis had been positioned to rise in House leadership and could have gotten some things done for Central Illinois. People can debate the federal budget all day long, but your job as a representative is to bring dollars back to your district, McMillan said. Lamenting the lost center. Oakland is a 90-minute drive east of Taylorville on roads dotted with silos cutting through vast fields of corn and soybeans. In this town of 739 people, residents said they have to drive 20 minutes to get to the nearest large grocery store. Many storefronts on the small central square have closed, and one features a sign that says, "Pritzker sucks," a slam on Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker and a hint at the town's conservative leanings. Coles County, which includes Oakland, voted 62% for Trump in the 2020 general election. The Millers, a prominent local farming and political family, have lived in the Oakland area for decades. Mary E. Miller, 64, originally from the western Chicago suburbs, is a longtime area resident who is married to Chris Miller, a Republican state representative and fourth-generation local farmer. They raise cattle, corn and soy on the family farm. According to her website, Mary is a wife, mother of 7, grandmother of 20, and local farmer who serves as a voice for families and farmers ignored by D.C. insiders in the swamp. In the most recent redistricting, Oakland was shifted from the 15th Congressional District, represented by Miller, into the 12th Congressional District, which stretches about 200 miles to the southern tip of the state. But Hinesboro, a town 6 miles west of Oakland where a Miller spokeswoman said the congresswoman and her family moved earlier this year, is in the 15th. The district is widely considered the most conservative in the state. After beating Davis in the primary, Miller crushed a Democratic challenger in the general election with 71% of the vote. "I have conversations with Mary quite a bit, but we can't elect her," said Oakland Mayor Jack Turner, a Republican who has known the Miller family for decades. "That was taken away from us, and I think that's unfair." Turner, 57, with a bushy gray beard and a sleeveless t-shirt that said, "Stars and Stripes since 1776, said that Miller's conservative politics represented the town well and that he believed the community was harmed in losing her to a partisan gerrymander. But he also lamented the loss of the moderate center in both parties and expressed disappointment in the Republican rebellion that ended in McCarthy's removal as Speaker. "Now you're either way left or way right," he said in an interview in the town's tiny municipal building. "There used to be a middle road, and the middle road was fine. Why does it have to be this extreme?" Morse reported from Washington. Graphics and data by Morse. Editing by Griffwit. Copy editing by Gilbert Dunkley. Project editing by Casey Shaper. Photo editing by Christine T. Nguyen. Data editing by Anu Narayanswamy. North Carolina Republicans override governor's veto on key election law. Governor Roy Cooper, Democrat, has cast the bill as a threat to democracy in the state. Republicans say it takes politics out of the process of administering the vote. North Carolina Republican lawmakers on Tuesday overrode the Democratic governor's veto of a bill that overhauls who runs elections and achieves a long-sought goal of the state's GOP. The legislation creates bipartisan boards that could deadlock on establishing early voting locations or certifying results in a state that may prove crucial in next year's presidential election. Democrats and election experts warn the changes risk creating dysfunction in 2024, with Governor Roy Cooper saying they could doom our state's elections to gridlock and severely limit early voting. The legislation, he said in his veto of the bill last month, also creates a grave risk that Republican legislators or courts would be empowered to change the results of an election if they don't like the winner. Republicans contend the bill helps guarantee elections will be run fairly by establishing bipartisan election boards that will take politics out of the process. When it comes to agencies doing their jobs, politics ought to not be part of it, House Speaker Tim Moore, Republican, said in a recent podcast appearance. Republicans have tried for years to remake the state elections board but came up against obstacles, including court decisions and a rejection from voters. Their 3/5 majorities in the state legislature now give them the power to override vetoes, which they did in the state Senate on Tuesday with a 30-19 vote and in the House with a 72-44 vote. Litigation is all but certain to follow. Currently, state and county election boards are controlled by the party of the governor, which means in recent years they have been run by Democrats. Under the GOP legislation, state lawmakers will appoint boards with equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. The legislation doesn't spell out how the boards will resolve most deadlocks. Some Republicans have said courts will have to figure out what to do if the state elections board fails to certify an election because Republicans and Democrats are at odds. There's a lot of uncertainty around what will happen with ties, said Christopher Cooper, a political science professor at Western Carolina University. That kind of confusion is not going to help trust in the system. Cooper, who is not related to the governor, said voters in North Carolina will see a new election landscape next year because of decisions made in recent months. They will have new legislative and congressional districts, a new voter ID law, new timelines for voting by mail and, in some locations, new early voting sites. That's a lot of change, he said. And communicating any one part of that to citizens is going to be extremely difficult in any environment, particularly one like this. Anderson Clayton, the chairwoman of the North Carolina Democratic Party, said the measure represented a dire threat that would limit voting options on college campuses and in large cities. That will create long lines that will deter some voters, she said. No one wants to wait in a line to go vote, she said. It's not something that is really encouraging people that a process is working and that something is effective. Moore, the House Speaker, did not respond to interview requests but recently told a podcast for the cable television network Spectrum News that bipartisan boards would foster cooperation. When it comes to administering our elections, that should be above reproach, he said. It should not have a partisan advantage to either side. In addition to the law governing election boards, Republican lawmakers overrode the veto of a bill that ends an extended deadline for submitting absentee ballots and empowers partisan poll watchers. Republicans have the power to override vetoes because they locked in 3/5 majorities in April when State Representative Tricia Cotham dropped her Democratic affiliation and became a Republican. Republican lawmakers first sought to change the makeup of the state elections board in 2016 with a law they passed after Cooper was elected governor but before he was sworn in. When a court blocked the law, they passed a modified version of it that was struck down by the North Carolina Supreme Court for violating the state constitution. GOP lawmakers in 2018 asked voters to approve an amendment to the state constitution that would have reshaped the state elections board. Voters rejected the idea with 62% of the vote. Republicans passed their latest bill to change election boards last month. In Cooper's veto of the measure, he alluded to the actions of former President Donald Trump after he lost the 2020 election in arguing the bill would make it easier for lawmakers or courts to try to reverse voting results. That's a serious threat to our democracy, particularly after the nation just saw a presidential candidate try to strong-arm state officials into reversing his losing election result, Cooper said at the time. Senate Majority Leader Paul Newton, Republican, said during Tuesday's floor debate that the measure was important because it makes election boards truly and literally bipartisan. This structure does not favor a party nor does it favor a single elected official, and thus the inherent fairness should help restore voter confidence, he said. State Senator Natalie Murdoch, Democrat, disputed that contention, saying the bill would likely limit opportunities to vote. This bill was never about strengthening our elections, she said on the floor. It's about a power grab. Tuesday's override sets the stage for the bill to go into effect starting January 1st. Lawsuits are expected, but the makeup of the North Carolina Supreme Court has shifted since it issued its 4-3 decision in 2018 striking down changes to the state elections board. In elections last year, Republicans established a 5-2 majority on the state Supreme Court. Within months, it reversed two major recent rulings, allowing the voter photo ID law to go into effect and allowing GOP lawmakers to draw legislative and congressional. The veto override will dissolve the 5-member state elections board and replace it with a new, evenly divided 8-member one. If the board fails to select a chairperson or fails to hire an executive director, lawmakers will get to choose who takes those spots. That provision could end current executive director Karen Brinson-Bell's tenure. She has held the position since 2019 but has come under criticism from some Republicans for easing absentee ballot rules during the coronavirus pandemic. The changes were part of a court settlement that was approved by the Elections Board. The state board is responsible for determining where to establish early voting sites when a county elections board can't unanimously agree on them. If the state board reaches an impasse on where to place them for a county, then that county will get just one early voting site. Democrats fear Republicans will vote against early voting plans for urban counties with large Democratic populations, preventing them from getting multiple early voting sites. The bill doesn't specify how deadlocks on other issues, such as certifying results, will be resolved. State Senate President pro tempore Phil Berger in June said such disputes could be resolved in court, according to the News and Observer. Megan Bowler-Bellamy, Vice President of Law and Policy with the Voting Rights Lab, raised concerns about how the legislation could affect people's perceptions about elections. Deadlocked boards and partisan fights over election administration likely will hurt the public's views about the voting system, she said. That's enough damage to really have severe implications for the confidence that every single North Carolinian feels, she said. The other veto that lawmakers overrode will put in place a law requiring absentee ballots to be returned to election officials by the time polls close on Election Day. Previously, absentee ballots were counted as long as they were postmarked by Election Day and received by election offices up to 3 days after Election Day. In 2020, the 3-day grace period allowed about 12,300 additional ballots to be counted, according to the State Elections Board. In 2022, about 8,600 such ballots were counted. Elections in North Carolina are often close, with one state Supreme Court race being decided in 2020 by fewer than 500 votes. Trump won North Carolina by 4 points in 2016 and by less than 2 points in 2020. Both parties are making the state a top target in the 2024 races for president and governor. Cooper is term limited and not running for re-election. The bill affecting absentee voting also allows partisan poll observers to move freely around polling places and listen to conversations between voters and poll workers. In addition, the bill bans private donations to fund election administration in response to the more than $400 million in donations that Facebook co-founder Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, gave to groups that helped fund election expenses in 2020. Critics have argued it's unfair to have private groups decide how to allocate resources for running elections because their funding could boost turnout for one side over the other. Since the 2020 election, 24 states have banned, limited or regulated such donations, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. Moments after the veto was overridden, the Democratic National Committee filed a lawsuit challenging provisions of the new law, including the one ending the grace period for absentee ballots. Another group, Voto Latino, filed a separate lawsuit challenging a part of the law that affects registering to vote at the polls. Republican effort to impeach Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice loses steam. Madison, Wisconsin, Republican lawmakers in this political battleground state appear to be easing off an effort to impeach a new liberal state Supreme Court justice who in her campaign promoted abortion rights and condemned gerrymandering. Shortly after Janet Protasiewicz was sworn into office in August, Wisconsin State Assembly Speaker Robin Vos, Republican, said he would consider impeaching her if she did not remove herself from a case challenging the state's legislative districts. Protasiewicz repeatedly called those districts rigged in favor of Republicans during her campaign, and Vos contended she had prejudged the issue. On Friday, Protasiewicz in a lengthy decision said she would not step aside in the case, writing that she had expressed her views on gerrymandering but had not specified how she would rule on a particular case. But rather than move ahead with impeachment proceedings, as threatened, Vos fell silent. Wisconsin is the latest state to exemplify the increasingly high stakes at play in judicial races. Protasiewicz, her opponent, political parties and interest groups spent more than $50 million on the race, the most ever on a judicial race in the country's history. Protasiewicz's victory ended 15 years of conservative control of the court and gave liberals a 4-3 majority that could issue decisions affecting abortion rights, voting policies, environmental regulations, and the certification of the next presidential election. Her decision to remain on the case raises the likelihood the court will redraw the district lines before next year's election. Republicans view the case as an existential threat to their large majorities in the legislature, but Vos's reaction to Protasiewicz's decision to remain on the case was restrained. On Friday and through the weekend, the speaker remained quiet. On Monday, Vos issued a short written statement that said she should have recused herself but didn't mention impeachment. On Tuesday, documents were made public that showed a conservative former state Supreme Court justice tasked with advising Vos concluded that impeachment was not warranted. To sum up my views, there should be no effort to impeach Justice Protasiewicz on anything we know now, former Justice David Prosser wrote in a Friday memo to Vos. Vos in recent days has not responded to questions about whether he is still considering impeachment. The idea has divided Republicans, and attempting it would prove more difficult now that Prosser has determined it isn't warranted. State Senator Dewey Strobel, Republican, one of the most conservative lawmakers in Wisconsin, told Milwaukee's CBS affiliate in remarks reported Tuesday that he opposed impeaching Protasiewicz, in part because Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers, Democrat, could replace her with someone else. Republicans hold 22 of the 33 seats in the state Senate, exactly the number needed to remove an official who has been impeached by the state assembly. Losing a single Senate vote could be fatal to their efforts because all Democrats are expected to rally behind Protasiewicz. Republicans in the state assembly hold 64 of 99 seats, well above the 50 votes they would need to impeach Protasiewicz. An impeachment would immediately bar Protasiewicz from acting on any cases and trigger intense pressure on the state Senate to hold a vote on whether to remove Protasiewicz or let her continue to serve. Vos last month said he had formed a panel of former justices to advise him on impeachment but declined to name who was on it. The watchdog group American Oversight last month filed a lawsuit arguing the group of former justices was subject to the state's open meetings law and had to conduct its work in public. In response to that lawsuit, Prosser released his memo and other documents. He also provided American Oversight with text messages and voice messages from former Chief Justice Patience Roggensack that suggest she has worked on the issue with Prosser. Those messages do not reveal her views on impeachment, but in one voice message she argued the group of former justices were not subject to the open meetings law. "We're just ad hoc people who have an interest in what's going on," she said. The threats to impeach Protasiewicz have come alongside an effort to remove the state's nonpartisan elections director, Megan Wolfe, from her job. Republicans in the state Senate last month voted to fire her, but lawyers for the legislature told them they didn't have the power to do that. Wolfe has continued in her job, and Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul, Democrat, has filed a lawsuit to try to ensure she keeps her position. In response, some Republicans have contended they should impeach Wolfe.